Karen stood on the front porch, gazing up at the old house that would soon be hers. The weathered wood of the porch creaked under her feet, and the wind rustled the leaves of the overgrown ivy that crawled up the house's brick facade. It was everything she and Nathan had dreamed of, a fresh start away from the chaos of the city. "Do you feel that?" she asked, looking over her shoulder at her husband. Nathan was leaning against the doorway, scanning the property. He was a man who often seemed to find comfort in the rational, the explainable. "Feel what?" he asked with a raised eyebrow. Karen shrugged, a slight shiver running down her spine despite the warm afternoon sun. "I don't know. It just feels old. I can almost feel the history in the air." Nathan smiled, taking a step toward her. "That's just the charm of an old house. That's why we bought it, remember? It has character. It's what we need." Karen nodded, forcing a smile, though the unease in her chest wouldn't fade. She had researched the house, of course, looked into its history, its ownership, the mysterious disappearances of its previous tenants, but nothing prepared her for how the house felt in person. It wasn't just old. It felt abandoned, as if it had been waiting for them, as if it had been holding its breath. "Well, I'm glad you like it," she said, trying to shake the feeling. "Let's get inside. We have a lot to unpack." Nathan took her hand and led her inside. The front door creaked as it opened, revealing the shadowed interior. Dust hung thick in the air, and the wooden floors groaned underfoot. The smell of old wood and mildew hit her immediately. As they walked through the hallway, Karen paused, glancing into the dining room. There was something off about the shadows, something about the way the light fell across the room. It wasn't quite right. Her heart quickened, but she dismissed it as nerves. "Maybe we should open a window," Karen said softly, her voice suddenly trembling. "It feels stuffy in here." Nathan glanced over at her, concern flickering in his eyes. "It's fine, it's just an old house, we'll air it out." But Karen couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching them, that it had been waiting. The days passed quickly as Karen and Nathan settled into their new home. They spent their mornings unpacking, their evenings sharing quiet dinners. But despite the comforting routine, Karen couldn't shake the unsettling sense that something was wrong with the house. She tried to push the feeling away, telling herself it was just the stress of the move, the change, and the overwhelming weight of the unknown. But every now and then, she'd hear something, a soft creaking in the walls, a whisper of wind in the dead of night, or the faint sound of footsteps echoing through the empty halls when she was alone. Nathan didn't seem to notice these things, or at least he didn't acknowledge them. One evening, after a long day of organizing boxes, Karen wandered into the upstairs hallway. She was drawn, inexplicably, to a door she hadn't noticed before. It was tucked away in a far corner, half hidden behind a thick curtain of ivy that had long since overgrown the window. The door was plain, unremarkable, but something about it sent a chill down her spine. It didn't belong. Curious, she approached it, her hand hovering over the doorknob. She paused, sensing the cold air on the other side. Something told her not to open it, that it had been sealed for a reason, but her curiosity won out. With a soft creak, the door opened. Inside was a small room, dusty, forgotten. The air was thick with the weight of years of neglect. But it wasn't just the room that caught her attention, it was the mirror. It stood at the far end of the room, leaning against the wall, as if it had been placed there in haste. It was large, the glass surface covered in a layer of grime, but as she drew closer, Karen's breath caught in her throat. There was something about the mirror, something unnerving. She could see faint shapes within the reflection, but they didn't match the room around her. For a moment, it was as if the mirror was reflecting another place, another time. Her pulse quickened as she wiped the grime away from the glass. As she did, the reflection seemed to change, becoming clearer, revealing a faint outline of a figure, someone standing in the doorway watching her. Karen stepped back, heart pounding. She spun around, but no one was there. She stood frozen, her mind racing. She couldn't explain what she had seen, but one thing was certain. The room, the mirror, everything about it felt wrong. That night, Karen couldn't sleep. The house was too quiet, the silence pressing in on her, making it hard to breathe. She tossed and turned, but every time she closed her eyes, she saw the reflection in the mirror, the shadowy figure standing just behind her. She had to know more. She couldn't let it go. What was it about that room? What was it about the mirror? The next morning, Karen decided to explore the house further. She pulled out the old house records she had found in a drawer the night they arrived. They were barely legible, but she managed to make out the name of the house's previous owners, the Darnell family. The Darnells had lived in the house for nearly 30 years before mysteriously disappearing. There had been rumors, of course, whispers of strange happenings, sightings of figures in the windows, lights flickering at odd hours. The house had been abandoned for years after their disappearance, until it was eventually sold. Karen's curiosity got the better of her. She decided to visit the town's historical society to learn more about the Darnells. Mr. Alden, the elderly historian, was the only person who seemed to remember the family. "Ah, the Darnells," Mr. Alden said, his voice low as he stared at Karen across the dusty desk. "A tragic story, that one. They were fine people, but they got involved in something they shouldn't have. Something dark. Some say they tried to make contact with something not of this world." Karen's stomach tightened. "What happened to them?" "Nobody knows for sure," Mr. Alden replied, his eyes narrowing. "The whole family, mother, father, 2 young children, vanished without a trace. The house was left standing, but something changed when they left. The place, it's not just a house. It's something more. Something waiting." Karen left the historical society with more questions than answers, but one thing was clear. The house had a history, a dark and twisted history. And the forgotten room? It was only the beginning. Karen's mind raced as she left the historical society, the words of Mr. Alden echoing in her ears. Something waiting. What did that mean? And why had the Darnell family vanished so mysteriously? The more she thought about it, the more she felt the weight of the house pressing down on her. It wasn't just a house. It was a place trapped in time, cursed by something that had taken root long ago. That evening, Karen couldn't focus on anything. She tried to prepare dinner, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the forgotten room, the mirror, the whispers she heard at night. Nathan was in the study as usual, buried in work, but Karen couldn't shake the feeling that she was alone in the house, despite his presence. The walls seemed to close in on her, the silence too thick, too heavy. She decided to return to the room she had opened that afternoon. It felt like the key to understanding what was happening here, to finding the answers that eluded her. The upstairs hallway was dark now, the sun having long since dipped below the horizon. Karen's footsteps echoed as she walked toward the room, her hand trembling as it reached for the door handle. She had hoped that maybe it was all in her head, that perhaps she had been imagining things, but the cold air from the room greeted her like an old friend, and when she pushed the door open, she was met with the same chilling sight. The mirror was still there, its dusty surface reflecting nothing but shadows. She stepped inside, her heartbeat loud in her chest. The air was thick with the same strange energy that had enveloped her the first time she entered. She hesitated, wondering if she should leave, but something about the mirror pulled her in. This time she stepped closer, and as she wiped away the grime, the reflection appeared again, clearer this time and unmistakably real. The figure in the mirror was a woman, standing in what seemed to be an older version of the room. Her hair was dark, pulled back in a simple bun, and she wore a dress that looked out of place, from another era entirely. Karen's breath caught in her throat. The woman was smiling, her face soft with kindness, but there was something wrong in her eyes. The moment Karen met the woman's gaze, the smile faded, and the woman's mouth moved, though no sound reached Karen's ears. But the message was clear. Get out. The whisper in Karen's mind was as sharp as a blade, and she stumbled back, her hand clutching her chest as if she had been struck. The woman's face blurred for a moment, and then the reflection shifted. The room changed. The walls were no longer the same, now lined with dark, aged furniture, and the door, no longer ajar, was sealed shut. The house groaned, the floorboards creaking under the strain. Karen spun around, her heart pounding, but the room was the same as before. The woman in the mirror was gone. "Karen?" Nathan's voice broke through the tension, his tone distant and confused. She turned toward the door where Nathan stood, leaning against the frame. He looked tired, his shirt untucked and his eyes rimmed with dark circles. Karen opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. She shook her head instead, trying to clear her thoughts. "Nathan, you look like you've seen a ghost," Nathan said, his lips curling into a weak smile. "What's going on?" Karen felt a cold chill wash over her as she glanced back at the mirror. "I saw someone, a woman, in the mirror." Nathan stepped inside, his footsteps heavy against the old wood. He looked at the mirror, then back at her, eyes narrowing slightly. "Are you sure you're okay? You've been acting strange lately." "I'm fine," she said, though she didn't believe it herself. "But there's something wrong with this house, I know it." Nathan didn't respond immediately. He stepped past her, staring at the mirror. "It's just an old house, Karen. We're still settling in. It's probably just the stress of moving." But Karen wasn't convinced. She had seen the woman's face so clearly. The reflection hadn't been a trick of the light. It had been real. "The Darnells," she said, her voice quiet. They vanished from this house. They were involved in something dark." Nathan's face tightened, the skepticism in his eyes shifting to something more cautious. "What are you talking about?" Karen felt a surge of frustration. "I went to the Historical Society today. Mr. Alden told me. He told me the family tried to summon something. They tried to contact something not of this world." Nathan frowned. "And you believe that?" Karen nodded, her pulse quickening. "I don't know what to believe, but there's something in this house, Nathan. I can feel it. It's like the house is alive and we're just here to witness it." Nathan didn't answer right away. He stood in silence, looking at the mirror. Then, in a voice that seemed a little too quiet, he said, "Maybe we should just leave." Karen's heart stopped. "Leave?" she repeated, shocked. "What do you mean, leave?" Nathan turned toward her, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity she had never seen before. "Maybe this house isn't worth it. Maybe we should just cut our losses and move on." Karen felt a pang of panic. "Nathan, we've only just gotten here. This was supposed to be our fresh start." "I know," Nathan said, his voice soft but firm. "But I can't ignore the feeling, Karen. I've felt it too. Something's wrong here." Karen stared at him, her thoughts whirling. She had always known that Nathan was the practical one, the one who preferred logic over superstition. But this wasn't just superstition. It was real. "Please," she said, taking a step toward him. "Don't you feel it? The house, it's calling us. It's pulling us in." Nathan's face softened slightly, but he still looked uncertain. "Maybe. But maybe it's time we get out before it pulls us in too far." That night the house seemed quieter than usual, but the tension between Karen and Nathan had never been more palpable. She couldn't shake the image of the woman in the mirror. The warning was still fresh in her mind. Get out. But where could they go? This was their home, their new beginning. The house was supposed to give them a fresh start, but instead it was breaking them down from the inside. Karen didn't want to admit it, but she could feel herself losing control. Something was happening to her, something that went beyond just the house. It felt as if the very air around her was thickening, as if the walls were closing in. Karen sat on the edge of the bed, her eyes scanning the room. Nathan had fallen asleep, but she couldn't rest. She knew she had to do something drastic. The mirror. She needed answers. She needed to understand the woman in the reflection, why the house was drawing her in, why it felt like it was alive. She got up from the bed, moving silently down the hallway toward the forgotten room. The house seemed to groan with every step she took, but she was determined. She had to face it. When she reached the room, the mirror gleamed in the low light, waiting for her. Karen stood before it once more, staring into its depths. This time the woman appeared again. She was no longer smiling. Her face was twisted in agony, her eyes pleading. You should have left when you had the chance. Karen stepped back, fear gripping her chest. But it was too late. The house had already made its decision. Karen could feel the weight of the woman's words echoing in her mind. You should have left when you had the chance. The reflection in the mirror had become more than just a vision. It was a warning. And yet Karen couldn't tear herself away. She had always been one to face things head on, to confront the unknown. But this felt different. The air around her grew thick, suffocating, as if the house itself was holding its breath. She glanced at Nathan, who was still asleep in their room. Despite his unease, he didn't truly believe in the house's power. She couldn't understand how he could dismiss it all, as if the warnings, the whispers, the reflection weren't real. But to her, it was impossible to ignore. The house was alive, and it wanted them. Karen took a deep breath and approached the mirror once again. As her hand hovered above its surface, the glass rippled like water. The woman's face materialized again, though this time her expression was different. It was not the pleading or the agony, but something far darker, more determined. The woman's lips parted, but her voice was not one Karen could hear. It was a deep, rumbling vibration that pulsed in her chest, as if the house itself were speaking. You cannot leave now. The words filled her mind, and the room seemed to close in on her. You are part of this now. There is no escape. Karen staggered back, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The door slammed behind her with a deafening bang, and the mirror's surface seemed to ripple, distorting the reflection of the room. Karen? Nathan's voice, low and distant, reached her from behind the door. He was awake now, but something about his voice didn't sound quite right. She spun around, but the room was empty. She could still hear him calling her name, but the sound was muffled, distant, almost as if he were calling from another place. Nathan, she cried out, her voice trembling. Nathan, where are you? The floor beneath her feet suddenly groaned, and Karen stumbled forward, only catching herself by grabbing the edge of the wall. Her pulse raced and her mind whirled. Where is he? She rushed to the door and flung it open, but when she stepped into the hallway there was nothing but silence. Nathan's voice had disappeared completely. The house seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something. She had a horrible sinking feeling that something had changed, that the house was no longer just a place but a force, and she was at its mercy. The hallway stretched out before her, longer than she remembered. The walls seemed to close in, and the shadows twisted, elongating like dark, crawling fingers. She called out to Nathan again, but her voice was swallowed by the oppressive quiet. A faint light flickered from the end of the hallway, her only guide in the growing darkness. She hesitated for only a moment before moving forward, drawn to it as though something unseen was pulling her closer. With each step, the shadows seemed to grow thicker, pressing in from all sides. When Karen reached the end of the hallway, she found herself in front of a door she had never noticed before. It stood at the farthest corner of the house, as if it had always been there, yet somehow never part of the layout she had come to know. The door was old, with intricate carvings etched into the wood, but it wasn't the design that caught her attention. It was the faint sound coming from behind it, a low, steady thrum, like a heartbeat. Karen's pulse raced. She didn't know why she felt compelled to open it, but she couldn't resist. She reached for the handle, the cool metal cold against her skin. The moment she touched it, the house seemed to exhale, the walls creaking, the air growing even heavier. The door opened slowly, revealing a small, dimly lit room. The air inside was thick with dust, and the heavy scent of something old and rotting filled her nostrils. But it was the center of the room that drew her attention, an altar of sorts made from stone. On it, in the dim light, lay a collection of strange objects, sacred symbols, a book bound in dark leather, and a ring with an unfamiliar symbol carved into it. Karen stepped inside. unable to take her eyes off the altar. She didn't understand why, but she knew that this was it. This was the reason she had been drawn to the house. The house had been waiting for her, for the right moment, and now it had her. As she stepped closer, her eyes fell on the book. The cover was covered in strange, indecipherable writing, but she could sense the power that emanated from it. Without thinking, she reached out and opened the book. The moment her fingers touched the pages, the room seemed to shift. The walls closed in on her, and the air thickened with an oppressive weight. The mirror in the forgotten room flashed in her mind's eye, and she could see the woman again, her face now distorted, her eyes glowing with a malevolent light. Karen slammed the book shut, her hands trembling. What have I done? The sound of footsteps behind her froze her in place. Slowly, Karen turned, her heart in her throat. There, in the doorway, stood Nathan, but his eyes were not the eyes she knew. They were cold, dark, his pupils narrowed to slits. "Nathan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He stepped forward, his movements slow, deliberate. "Karen," he said in a voice that was his, and yet not. It was deeper, more resonant, as if something else had taken control of him. "You should have left when you had the chance." Karen's heart raced as Nathan took another step forward. His eyes locked on hers. The warmth she had once seen in them was gone, replaced by something far darker. His face remained impassive, his movements unnatural. He was there, but not there. Someone else had taken hold of him. "Nathan, please." Karen's voice cracked, her breath coming in short gasps. "What's happening to you?" Nathan's lips curled into a faint, almost mocking smile. "You opened the door, Karen. You sought knowledge, and now you must pay the price." His voice deepened further, an unnatural resonance filling the air, vibrating in her chest. Karen stumbled back, fear tightening around her chest. No, this isn't you. This isn't real." But as she looked at him, the darkness that had overtaken his face only deepened, and the weight of his words sank in. The house had claimed him, just like it had claimed the Darnell family before them. "You made the wrong choice," he continued, his voice now a strange, guttural sound that sent chills crawling up Karen's spine. "You should have never come here. The house chooses, Karen. The house always chooses." Before she could react, Nathan's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with a grip that was unyielding. His fingers felt like ice, his touch not his own. "Come," he whispered. "It's time to finish what you started." The world around her seemed to collapse as Nathan dragged her toward the altar. The once comforting walls of the house now felt like prison bars closing in around her. The air was thick with power, the room pulsating with an ancient energy that Karen could not understand. The mirror, the book, the altar, it all led here. She had unwittingly played her part in a ritual much older than her, much older than anyone in this house. And now, the price had come due. Karen fought against Nathan's hold, but her strength was no match for the force that controlled him. The house's power had already taken hold. "Finish what we started, Karen," Nathan whispered, his voice now entirely foreign, entirely dark. Karen's mind screamed for escape, but deep down she knew it was already too late. Karen's pulse raced as Nathan dragged her toward the altar. The room seemed to warp around her, the walls stretching and bending like living things. The air was thick with a presence that was not human, something ancient and powerful that had been waiting for her to arrive. She could feel it now, the weight of it pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. "No!" she screamed, pulling against Nathan's iron grip, but his strength was unyielding. His face was locked in an expression of calm, but there was something in his eyes that terrified her. He wasn't Nathan anymore. The altar loomed ahead, its stone surface covered in strange symbols that seemed to shift before her eyes. The book lay open on it, pages filled with cryptic writing that made her head spin. Karen tried to look away, but the symbols seemed to draw her in, their energy pulsing with an almost magnetic pull. "Stop, please," Karen gasped, struggling to breathe as the presence in the room seemed to close in around her. But Nathan, or whatever had taken him, didn't stop. He pulled her forward until she was standing beside the altar, her legs weak, knees trembling beneath her. "You have to finish it, Karen," he whispered, his voice so low it was almost a growl. "You know what you have to do." Karen's chest tightened as she tried to back away. "I don't know what you're talking about. I never wanted this. I just wanted to get away, to start fresh." "You were always meant to be here," Nathan said, his voice distant. "The house has been waiting for you, waiting for someone to finish what the Darnells couldn't. The ritual was incomplete, and now it's your turn." Tears filled Karen's eyes as she looked around the room trying to find an escape, but the house was closing in. The walls seemed to pulse with energy, the shadows stretching unnaturally. The mirror in the corner, the one that had first shown her the woman's face, now glowed with an eerie light. Karen turned back to Nathan, but his face had completely transformed. His eyes were black, his features hollow, as if the very soul had been drained from him. This isn't Nathan, she realized with a sickening certainty. This is something else. Suddenly, a low, guttural voice echoed through the room, shaking the very foundation of the house. "You are mine now. You are part of it. The house cannot be denied." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, reverberating in Karen's mind, twisting and turning. She felt the pull of it, powerful, irresistible. And for the first time, she understood that the house wasn't just alive. It was a being in its own right, a force of unimaginable power that had waited for generations to find someone strong enough to complete the ritual, someone willing enough to give up everything. Karen's body trembled, not just from fear, but from something deeper. Something inside her, a part of the house itself, was stirring. The reflection of the woman appeared again in the mirror, and Karen's heart skipped a beat. The woman's face was still twisted in agony, but this time she reached out as if trying to grab Karen. "No," Karen thought, horrified. "Please, I can't." But it was too late. The house had already chosen her. The mirror's reflection began to shift, showing scenes of what had happened to the Darnell family. She saw the mother, the father, and the two children, all gathered around the altar, performing the same ritual. But something had gone wrong. The mother's face was twisted in pain as she screamed. The father's body convulsed with an unnatural force. The children were crying, their eyes wide with terror, but it was too late. The house had taken them, just as it was now taking Karen. Karen felt a cold hand slip into hers. She looked up to see Nathan standing beside her, or at least what was left of him. His body was no longer human. It was an empty vessel, consumed by the house. His mouth moved, but it wasn't his voice. "Take the ring, Karen," the voice urged. "It's the key. Complete the ritual. Become one with the house, or die trying." Karen's breath hitched as her eyes locked on the ring resting on the altar, the symbol etched into it pulsing with dark energy. It was the final piece of the puzzle, the last step in completing the ritual that would bind her to the house forever. She could feel it. She could feel the house pulling her toward it, ready to consume her entirely. But something deep inside her refused. She wasn't ready to surrender. Not yet. With all the strength she could muster, Karen yanked her hand free from Nathan's grasp, stumbling back from the altar. "No!" she cried out. "I won't!" But as she backed away, the house reacted. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows growing thicker, more oppressive. The air became heavier, and she could feel the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes on her. The house wasn't going to let her escape. Not now. "Karen?" Nathan's voice hissed from behind her, but it was no longer him. It was the house, speaking through him. "You cannot fight it. You're already part of it." Karen's chest tightened as she turned toward the door, but before she could reach it, the walls shifted again, the space warping and twisting. The hallway she had walked down only moments ago was gone, replaced by a chasm of darkness. It felt as though the house had become a labyrinth with no escape. The air grew thick with the scent of decay, and Karen felt as though the floor was about to give way beneath her feet. In desperation, she turned toward the mirror one last time. The woman's face was still there, her eyes now wide with fear. She was reaching out, urging Karen to act, to complete the ritual before it was too late. With trembling hands, Karen grabbed the book from the altar, flipping through the pages in a frenzy. She didn't understand most of the symbols, but one page caught her eye. A single line of text that seemed to stand out, glowing with an unnatural light. It read, "To break the bond, one must give what was taken, but what is given can never return." Karen's heart raced. The words burned in her mind, and as she read them over and over, the meaning became clear. To break the curse, she had to give everything. Her soul, her essence, the very thing the house had been waiting for. And yet, if she did it, she would lose herself. Completely. But there was no other way. The house was closing in. The darkness was all around her. She had to act. Karen looked at Nathan, or what was left of him, and whispered a final plea. "I'm sorry." She closed her eyes, and with one last trembling breath, she began the incantation, the words spilling from her lips. The air hummed with power, the walls trembling as the house reacted to her command. The mirror flickered, showing her the woman's face one last time. But this time, her expression was peaceful, almost relieved. As Karen finished the chant, the entire house groaned, a low guttural sound that seemed to come from the very depths of the earth. The darkness around her began to dissipate, the weight of the house lifting, but not without cost. She could feel herself slipping, her body fading, becoming one with the house just as the woman before her had. And then, everything went dark. When Karen opened her eyes, she was no longer in the house. She was outside, standing in the middle of a forest. The sun was setting, casting an eerie glow across the trees. The house was gone. But something was wrong. The air was thick with silence. The only sound was the faint rustle of leaves. And then she heard it, a whisper in the wind. "You are free, but you are never truly gone." Karen stood in the forest, her mind swirling with confusion and fear. The house was gone, vanished into the nothingness that seemed to follow her every step. The trees around her were unfamiliar, their twisted limbs reaching toward the sky like skeletal hands. The air was thick with the scent of decay, yet there was a strange sense of relief that clung to her as well. Her body felt light, as though she were no longer tethered to the earth. She could hear the faint rustling of the leaves, the whisper of the wind through the branches, but there was no sign of Nathan, no sign of anyone. Was I dreaming, she thought, looking around the desolate landscape? Am I still trapped in the house? The whisper from the wind seemed to answer her. "You are free, but you are never truly gone." Karen shuddered, the voice resonating deep within her soul. It wasn't her own thoughts, it was something else, something ancient. The house, or whatever it was, still lingered in her mind, wrapping around her consciousness like a living thing. She could still feel its presence, a faint pulse that echoed in her chest. "Is this it?" she whispered aloud, her voice breaking the silence. "Am I free? Or have I just traded one prison for another?" The wind picked up, swirling around her, and a figure appeared in the distance. At first it was just a shadow, but as it drew closer, Karen's breath caught in her throat. It was Nathan. But this Nathan was different. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, hollow. His skin had taken on a grayish tint, and his body seemed thinner, as if the life had been drained from him. "Nathan?" Karen called, her voice trembling. "Is it really you?" He stopped a few feet away from her, his expression empty. The wind howled through the trees, and for a moment Karen could have sworn she heard the faintest echo of the house, its groans, its whispers, faint but unmistakable. "It's me, Karen," Nathan said, his voice distant. "Or what's left of me." Tears welled in Karen's eyes. "What do you mean? I thought I saved you." "You did," Nathan replied, his gaze vacant. "But the house doesn't let go. Not completely. It takes a part of you when it lets you go. And it doesn't just take... it changes you." Karen felt a chill run down her spine. She took a step toward him, reaching out, but he didn't move. "You're not really here, are you?" Nathan's lips twisted into a sad, twisted smile. "No, Karen, I'm not. The house keeps a part of you, even if you think you're free." It always has, and it will always call you back. Karen staggered back, her heart pounding. She couldn't breathe. She had fought so hard to escape, to end the nightmare, but it seemed like the nightmare wasn't over. It had just taken on a new form, a new prison. The house had claimed her, claimed them both. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "I won't go back. I won't." "You don't have a choice," Nathan said, his voice growing fainter. "The house chose you, Karen. It always will." He began to fade, his figure dissolving into the wind, leaving Karen standing alone in the forest. But she could still feel him, his presence lingering in the air, a shadow that would never quite leave her. Karen stumbled back, her heart racing, her mind reeling. The forest around her seemed to close in, the trees leaning toward her as if to swallow her whole. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't face this endless silence, this emptiness. She turned and began to walk, her steps slow and deliberate at first. But with each passing second, the pull grew stronger. The whispers in the wind seemed to grow louder, swirling around her like a storm. She could hear the house again, the groans of the walls, the faint murmur of voices. The house was never truly gone. It was part of her now, as much a part of her as the beating of her heart. She had escaped once, but she knew now that escape was an illusion. There was no true freedom. The house had claimed her, and it always would. The path before her was dark, winding, and endless. She walked for hours, though she couldn't say how long it had been. The trees stretched endlessly, the horizon distant and unreachable. She felt as though she were walking in circles, her feet dragging through the thick underbrush. The forest felt suffocating, and the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. Her mind flickered back to the altar, to the ritual, to the house. What had she done? What had she unleashed? Had she truly broken the curse, or had she just become another part of its dark legacy? The further she walked, the more the whispers seemed to grow louder. They were coming from everywhere, beneath her feet, in the wind, inside her mind. She could hear the voices of the Darnells, their pleas for help, their screams. The house had taken them, and now it was taking her. But then, a glimmer of light pierced the darkness ahead. Karen's heart leapt in her chest. She ran toward it, the light flickering like a beacon. It was all she could do to keep moving, to push through the suffocating fear that wrapped around her. As she drew closer, the light became clearer. It wasn't the sun, but a small lantern glowing softly on the edge of the path. Standing beside it was a figure, a woman, her face pale and drawn. She was dressed in old-fashioned clothing, the same clothes Karen had seen in the reflection of the mirror, the woman who had once been trapped in the house. The woman stepped forward, her eyes filled with sorrow. "You've come so far," she said softly, "but you cannot outrun the house. It is a part of you now." Karen felt the chill of the woman's words settle deep in her bones. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Help me." The woman's face softened, but her eyes were full of a deep, tragic understanding. "I cannot help you, Karen. No one can. The house will never let you go. You have been chosen as we all were. It is your fate." Karen's knees buckled and she collapsed to the ground. The weight of her journey, of her sacrifice, came crashing down on her. She had given everything to escape, to be free. But there was no freedom. The house had never truly let her go. It had just followed her, waiting for the moment when she would return. The woman knelt beside her, her voice a whisper in the wind. "You will always be a part of the house now, Karen, and it will always call you home." Karen's breath hitched as the woman's words sank in. "You will always be a part of the house now, Karen." The chill of those words wrapped around her like a shroud, and the weight of her past choices pressed down on her chest like an unbearable stone. She had thought that by confronting the house, by completing the ritual, she had won. But now she understood. The house was never meant to be escaped from. It had claimed her. Tears blurred her vision as she sat there on the cold ground, her fingers trembling as they dug into the earth. The forest was eerily silent, save for the faint rustling of leaves and the gentle whisper of wind through the trees. The lantern light flickered faintly, its glow weak and distant. The woman remained kneeling beside her, watching silently. "Why?" Karen whispered, her voice barely audible. "Why does it keep calling me? What does it want from me?" The woman's gaze softened, though there was no pity in her eyes, only a profound sorrow. "The house doesn't want anything from you, Karen. It doesn't need anything. It simply is. It has always been. It takes those who are drawn to it, those who can feel its pull. We were all chosen, as you were." "But I fought it," Karen choked out. "I fought it. I tried to escape." "And you did for a time," the woman said. "But the house is a part of you now. You may walk away from it, but it will always find a way back. It feeds on your fear, your desperation. It becomes a part of your soul." Karen closed her eyes, trying to gather her strength. She had to do something. There has to be a way out, she thought. There must be a way to break the cycle. The woman seemed to sense her thoughts. There is no breaking the cycle. The house feeds on the living. It thrives on the souls of those who enter, just as it once thrived on the Darnell family. You are its new vessel. You will carry it with you for the rest of your days. It will never release you. "But Nathan..." Karen's voice faltered. She could still feel him, a part of him, inside her. The way his eyes had turned hollow, the way his soul had been taken by the house. What happened to him? "He became the house's voice," the woman replied. "And you, Karen, will carry its burden now. Just as I did. Just as the others before you did." Karen's mind reeled, the realization settling like a stone in her stomach. She had lost Nathan. She had lost herself. The woman in front of her, the woman from the mirror, from the house, was the same as her. Another soul taken, another victim of the house's endless hunger. A low rumbling sound echoed through the forest, a deep vibration that seemed to come from beneath the earth itself. The air grew colder, and the trees swayed as if in response. Karen's heart pounded in her chest. The house, her house, was calling her again. "I can't go back," Karen gasped, her chest tightening. "I won't." The woman's face hardened, her expression unreadable. "You don't have a choice." Karen stood up suddenly, her legs weak beneath her. "No," she whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. "There has to be a choice. There must be another way." The woman rose to her feet with an eerie grace, her voice quiet but firm. "The house doesn't care about your will. It doesn't care about your desire to be free. It will always call you back. You will walk, you will fight, but the moment you stop running, the moment you stop struggling, you will return. The house waits, and when it has you, it will never let go." Karen spun around, her mind in chaos. She could still hear the house, that deep, vibrating hum that pulled at her very soul. Her body ached with exhaustion, but she forced herself to move. There had to be something, anything, that could free her from this nightmare. Her eyes fixed on the flickering lantern ahead. She started walking again, the woman's words still echoing in her mind. "You will always return." Karen's thoughts raced as she moved through the forest. She couldn't let it happen. She couldn't let the house claim her, couldn't let it devour her completely. She had to do something. But what? The lantern light danced in front of her, now moving as if beckoning her. She moved toward it, step by step, her feet dragging, her body aching with exhaustion. The weight of the house's presence pressed on her, suffocating her with every breath. Suddenly, the light flickered and dimmed, and the woman was there again, standing just in front of her, blocking the path. "Stop running," the woman said. "You cannot outrun it." "I don't care," Karen shouted, her voice shaking with fury. "I won't go back. I will never go back to that house. I will not let it win." The woman's face softened with pity, but there was no judgment. "It's not about winning, Karen. It's about understanding. The house is a part of you now. It is what you are, and you will never escape it." "No!" Karen screamed, her voice cracking with emotion. "I refuse to accept this. I won't let the house take me." The woman stepped aside, her face unreadable. "Then you will see the truth for yourself." Karen pushed past her, eyes wide with fear and defiance. She could feel the ground shifting beneath her feet, the world blurring, as if reality itself was starting to unravel. She had no choice. She had to keep moving, and then it happened. The ground split open, the forest vanished, and the house, her house, emerged from the darkness, its walls towering above her, the windows dark and hollow. It was the same as it had been, and yet something was different. The house was alive. It was watching her. She had returned. The doors swung open, and Karen was drawn inside. Inside, the house was even more oppressive than before. The air was thick with a heavy, musty scent, the shadows deeper and darker. The walls seemed to move, stretching and groaning under the weight of something ancient and powerful. Karen stumbled through the halls, her steps faltering. The house seemed to beckon her, whispering her name in a language she couldn't understand. She had no choice but to follow. There was a presence here. She could feel it. A presence that had always been here, even before her. It was older than the house, older than time itself. She reached the familiar door, the door to the forgotten room. She could see it in the distance, bathed in an eerie light. The same mirror awaited her, its surface glistening with malevolent energy. The house had led her here for a reason, and then she understood. The house hadn't taken her, Karen realized. It had become her. Her hands trembled as she reached for the mirror, her reflection staring back at her with hollow eyes. And in that moment, the truth was clear. The house didn't just claim souls. It bound them to its will, forcing them to become part of the house, to take its place. Karen had always been meant to become its new heart. Karen's reflection stared back at her from the mirror, but it wasn't her anymore. It was her, the part of herself that had been claimed by the house. Her eyes were hollow, empty, the spark of life gone. She could feel the shift within herself, the terrible reality that the house had become a part of her soul, her very essence. I am the house. She blinked hard, shaking her head, trying to reject it, but the more she fought it, the more the truth sank in. The house was alive inside of her. She was its heartbeat, its pulse, the anchor that would keep it bound to this world. And it was only a matter of time before the house called on her to take her place as its new keeper. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "No, I won't be like them. I won't be the house's prisoner." But as she stepped back from the mirror, she felt the pull of the walls. The house was alive, and it wanted her. It needed her. The door to the forgotten room slammed shut behind her, trapping her inside. The walls around her shifted, closing in, as if the house was tightening its grip, making sure she couldn't escape. The floor beneath her feet groaned as though it were alive, a deep hum vibrating through her bones. Karen's breath came in quick, shallow gasps. She was trapped. There was no way out. And then, the voice came. "Welcome home, Karen." It wasn't Nathan's voice. It wasn't a voice she could identify. It was the voice of the house itself, ancient and powerful, reverberating in her mind, a deep guttural hum that rattled her entire being. The house had always been there, hidden beneath the layers of time, waiting for someone like her. She closed her eyes tightly, clutching her hands to her ears as if to block out the voice. But it wasn't just in her ears. It was inside her mind, wrapping itself around her thoughts like vines. She couldn't escape it. "We've been waiting for you." Karen opened her eyes, and for the first time, she saw it clearly. The house. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with dark energy, the very air thick with it. Shadows moved along the edges of the room, figures and faces flickering in the corners of her vision. The house had taken on a life of its own, and it was now trying to consume her completely. The truth hit her like a freight train. The house wasn't just a building. It was a thing, a force. It had no beginning and no end. It existed as long as it needed to. It had claimed the Darnells. It had claimed her. And now it would take whatever it wanted. "You will become part of it," the voice continued, "just as the others did. You are its heart now." Karen gasped, stumbling back. The house, The entire house was inside her. Her heart beat faster, pounding in her chest as the weight of the revelation overwhelmed her. She could feel it now, the power of the house thrumming through her veins. The door to the room creaked open slowly. Karen turned, but she didn't move. She didn't have the strength to run. What was the point? There was nowhere left to escape to. The house had already claimed her. It would never let her go. And then she heard a voice. "Nathan?" The voice was weak, trembling, but it was Nathan's voice. Karen's heart leapt in her chest. She turned toward the door, but what she saw made her knees go weak. Standing in the doorway was Nathan, but this time, he was different. He was alive. His eyes were still dark, hollow, but his expression was familiar. The light of recognition flickered in his eyes as he stepped toward her, though his movements were stiff and unnatural, like a puppet whose strings were being pulled by the house itself. "Karen," he whispered again, his voice hoarse. "Karen, I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't mean for you to—" But Karen couldn't answer. She was frozen, paralyzed by the horror of what she was seeing. Nathan was here, yes, but he wasn't the same. He was a vessel for the house's will, just like the Darnells had been, just like she was becoming. "Please," he begged, his voice desperate now. I tried to stop it, but I couldn't. I couldn't." Karen reached out to him, her hands trembling, but she couldn't touch him. She couldn't touch anything. She could feel the house tightening its grip on her, pulling her into its web. She stepped back, shaking her head. "Nathan, no, don't you see? It's not you. It's the house." His face twisted in pain, and he collapsed to the ground in front of her, his hands clutching at his chest. He looked up at her with wide, pleading eyes. "I never wanted to be part of it. I never wanted this to happen." But Karen knew. It was too late for both of them. She turned toward the altar again, the book still open on its stone surface. It was calling her. She was calling it now. The house had made its claim, and it was her responsibility to fulfill the ritual, to finish what the Darnells had started. But as she stepped forward, something inside her snapped. A wave of pure rage surged through her, fueled by her desire to be free, free from the house, free from the shadows that had haunted her. She would not be its vessel. She would not become its heart. She grabbed the book from the altar, slamming it shut. The moment she did, the house screamed, a deep, tortured wail that shook the very walls, rattling the windows and the doors. The entire room seemed to shudder under the force of it. "No!" Karen shouted, her voice breaking with defiance. "I won't be your prisoner." The house responded with an ear-splitting crack, the floor beneath her feet shattering as the walls began to crumble. The mirror flickered and shattered, and the shadows in the room twisted, as if the house itself were screaming in agony. "Karen," Nathan's voice reached her one last time, weak and far away, but she didn't turn to look at him. She couldn't. She was no longer fighting the house for him. She was fighting it for herself. The ground trembled beneath her, and she felt herself being pulled toward the altar, toward the heart of the house. But she fought with everything she had left, pulling herself away from it. The darkness in the room swirled around her, but Karen resisted. "I am not you," she whispered fiercely, her voice trembling with exhaustion, but filled with a defiant fire. "I will not become you." And in that moment, she understood. The house had always been a parasite, feeding on the living, feeding on fear, feeding on loss. It took those who couldn't escape, who couldn't outrun it, and made them part of its soul. But Karen was different. She wasn't ready to become part of the house. She was ready to fight it, to rip it apart, piece by piece. The walls groaned, the house shuddered, and in a final, desperate act, Karen pushed herself forward, slamming the book against the altar with all her remaining strength. The house screamed, the walls cracked, and everything went dark. The world around Karen dissolved into a swirl of blackness, a chaotic, violent whirlwind that ripped through her body and mind. The house, the thing that had claimed her, was fighting back, its grip tightening around her, pulling her deeper into its suffocating embrace. She gasped for air, but the air was thick with an oppressive weight, as though the very space around her was pressing against her chest. The darkness enveloped her, but in the center of it, there was a faint flicker, a small, dim light as fragile and fleeting as a star. With every ounce of will she could summon, Karen pushed toward the light. The pull of the house was relentless, but she wouldn't let it win. She couldn't. She had already lost so much, but there was one thing she still had left, the will to fight. The light grew brighter as she moved toward it, and suddenly, her feet touched solid ground. She opened her eyes. The room was gone. The house was gone. Everything was gone. She was standing in an empty void surrounded by nothing but a vast, endless blackness. There were no walls, no floors, just the cold emptiness that stretched infinitely in all directions. Is this it? She thought, feeling the hollow emptiness in her chest. Is this my punishment? To be alone, forever, in the dark? But then, a voice whispered in the blackness. A voice that was both familiar and foreign, something deep and ancient. You are not alone. Karen froze, the words stirring something deep within her. The voice was soft, yet it seemed to come from every direction at once. It was the voice of the house, or perhaps it was something older, something that had always existed, waiting in the void. You fought, Karen, the voice continued, but you cannot escape what you have become. Tears stung her eyes as she fell to her knees, the weight of the words crushing her. I never wanted this, she whispered, her voice raw. I just wanted to be free. The darkness around her seemed to pulse with a strange energy, and for a moment Karen thought she saw a figure moving in the distance, a shadow flickering like a candle in the wind. Freedom is an illusion, the voice said, this time filled with a cold, cruel tone. You cannot escape what you have accepted. The house will always find a way back to you. Karen's chest tightened, and for a moment the hopelessness threatened to swallow her whole. What had she done? What had she become? She had tried to fight, tried to escape, but the house had won. It had always won. But then she remembered. Nathan. The Darnells. She wasn't alone in this. She wasn't the first to be claimed by the house. She wasn't the first to be consumed by it. But she would be the last. No, Karen whispered, her voice shaking but steady. I won't be your prisoner, not anymore. The voice in the darkness laughed, but it was a hollow sound without warmth. You cannot defy me. I am the house. I am the void, and I will claim what is mine. Karen clenched her fists, the fire of defiance rising in her chest once more. Number, I won't become part of you. I won't let you feed on me any longer. The voice faltered, just for a moment, and then the ground beneath her feet cracked open. The void began to swirl, the darkness shifting as if the very fabric of reality was being torn apart. Karen's body shook with the power of it, but she stood firm, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no more fear. She had nothing left to lose. And then she made a choice. With a guttural cry, Karen reached deep inside herself, tapping into the last remnants of her willpower. She reached for the darkness, not to fight it, but to absorb it, to take it within herself, to become the very thing the house had tried to make her. But this time, she would control it. The void trembled, the shadows recoiling as Karen's body surged with energy. The house screamed in agony, its influence writhing against her as she took its power, its essence into herself. She could feel it, the weight of it, the curse, the darkness, the endless hunger. And in that moment, Karen made her final choice. She embraced it. The house howled as Karen's form began to glow, a bright, blinding light filling the void. The power of the house, the very core of it, was now hers to control. She had become it, but she would not allow it to consume her, to trap her, like it had trapped so many others before. The swirling darkness began to dissipate, slowly at first, and then faster, as though the house itself was retreating from her control. The emptiness faded, replaced by a quiet stillness. The house's grip on her, on everyone, was broken. Karen stood alone, her body glowing with the power she had taken, but she was no longer a prisoner of the house. She had broken free. Karen awoke with a gasp, the sunlight spilling through the cracks in the curtains. She was back in the house, the same house, but it felt different now. The oppressive weight that had always clung to it was gone, replaced by something lighter, something freeing. She took a deep breath, closing her eyes for a moment, feeling the pulse of the house within her. But now it was no longer something she feared. It was a part of her, yes, but she controlled it, not the other way around. Karen stood up from the floor, her body trembling with the intensity of the energy that still surged within her. She glanced around the room, the forgotten room, now empty and quiet. The house, in all its haunted, dark glory, was still standing, but it had no more power over her. She had won. She had taken control. The house was no longer a prison. It was now her domain. With a new sense of purpose, Karen stepped out of the room, walking down the familiar winding hallways. She could feel the echoes of those who had come before her, Nathan, the Darnells, all of them, whispers in the walls, remnants of their presence. But they were not trapped anymore. The house was free, and so was she. And as Karen stepped outside into the bright, warm sunlight, she understood at last. The house would never claim another soul again.